With Russia's return to prominence following the reunification of the country, similar developments would happen to their south in China. The contemporary situation China found itself in was a direct result of their defeat at the hands of Japan in the Second Sino-Japanese War. Before the war, China was nominally ruled by the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalist party founded by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, now under the leadership of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. About a decade prior to the war, Chiang had reunified the fractured nation by militarily defeating major warlord factions and rivals within the Kuomintang itself. His efforts to solidify control over the country and the Kuomintang party would create many enemies for Chiang, something that would prove useful to Japan's future war effort. Chiang's rule would also be challenged by the burgeoning Communist Party of China, sparking the Chinese Civil War in August 1927. By late 1936, as the prospects of a Japanese invasion became more evident, several Kuomintang generals forced Generalissimo Chiang to cease hostilities with the CPC, forming a united front to face Tokyo. On July 7, 1937, the United Front would be tested as Japan would begin a full-scale military invasion of China. Owing to decades of internal turmoil and an industry lacking the capabilities to run a modern war effort, the joint Chinese armies began experiencing defeats at the hands of the Imperial Japanese Army. Within the first few years of fighting, the Japanese would capture major Chinese cities such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing. These setbacks would force the Chinese government to relocate to the southwestern city of Chongqing, away from the front lines and protected by mountainous terrain. As the war raged on, Chiang Kai-shek's government would soon experience a blow within the defection of prominent Kuomintang leader Wang Jingwei. This defection arose from the many disagreements between Wang Jingwei and Chiang Kai-shek, stemming from their power struggle to take leadership role of the Kuomintang after Sun Yat-sen's death in 1925. In the debate concerning Japanese aggression, the two would also heavily disagree on policy. Chiang was adamant not to concede to Japan, even if it meant war. Meanwhile, Wang believed that China was not ready for war and that it still needed time to industrially and militarily develop. He urged for continued peace between the two nations whenever he could. As Minister of Foreign Affairs and later as Vice President of the Kuomintang, Wang urged Chiang to make peace with the Japanese, calls which were ignored by the Generalissimo. A year into the war, it became increasingly clear that Chiang Kai-shek would not attempt to negotiate with Tokyo, despite the major losses experienced by China. Frustrated, Wang Jingwei and a group of loyal supporters within the Kuomintang resigned from their government posts and left China to attempt to negotiate an end to the war with Japan. Although his negotiations with the Japanese would not result in peace, they allowed him to establish the reorganized national government of the Republic of China in Nanjing. In the first years of its establishment, the reorganized government was little more than a dollhouse for Wang and his loyalists, as the Japanese did not grant them any political or administrative powers. However, as the Japanese continued to take considerable progress in their war against China, collaboration with local political actors increasingly became a necessity to maintain their influence over the country after the war. The reorganized national government of the Republic of China thus began to grow in importance, becoming central to Japan's plan to maintain influence in the country. By 1944, China's prospects were looking grim. The end of the war in the West dashed any hopes of defeating Japan. To make a dire situation worse, Japan's 1944 assault on the city of Chongqing was a major blow to Chinese morale, as Chiang Kai-shek and CPC chairman Mao Zedong were slain in battle. After another year of fighting, the remaining Chinese forces would surrender to Japan on the 9th of September 1945. The Second Sino-Japanese War, which had lasted 8 years and resulted in the deaths of more than 20 million Chinese soldiers and civilians, as well as 700,000 Japanese soldiers, finally came to an end. As the dust settled in China, Tokyo would begin shaping a new regional order over the carcass of Chiang's Republic of China. Manchuria and Guangdong would be separated from the rest of China and turned into states of their own, the former becoming the power base of the Kwantung Army, while the latter served Zaibatsu corporate interests. Meanwhile, de jure control over the rest of the country would be given to the reorganized national government of the Republic of China, led by President Chen Gongbo after Wang Jingwei's untimely death in 1944. Despite the facade of sovereignty, the reorganized republic was little more than a rump state, fractured from within by provincial warlordism and parliamentary infighting, forcing it to submit to Tokyo's will. It was under these conditions that one Gao Zongwu would step in and change the trajectory of China's fate forever. Before gaining prominence, Gao had been a professor in Nanjing University, writing his dissertation on the importance of Sino-Japanese diplomacy. This brought him into the orbit of Wang Jingwei, who offered him to serve in the diplomatic corps to salvage the souring of Sino-Japanese relations. When Wang defected during the war, Gao followed him in hopes that peace could be made between the two sides, bringing him into the reorganized national government to help negotiate the treaties with Japan. However, when the final treaty between Japan and Wang Jingwei was signed, Gao was horrified at the number of concessions China was to make. This injustice would make him vehemently anti-Japanese in private, bringing him closer to the reformist factions within the party. The combination between his reformist tendencies and his old guard credentials would prove beneficial when the government fell into factional infighting in 1951 following Chen Gongbo's resignation. After 5 years of a bitter power struggle between the center KMT reformists and the right KMT old guard, the two sides would settle in the middle by appointing Gao Zongwu as president of China. Now at the highest office of the Republic, Gao would set off on a long and arduous road to recover China's sovereignty, dignity, and future. Early into his presidency, Gao announced a program of 5 modernizations, outlining the areas of focus required to bringing China into equal footing with Japan. This included education, technology, industrialization, militarization, and eventually reunification. Prior to the modernization, China had been an agrarian nation with a social basis that consisted mainly of illiterate peasants, alongside a handful of small shopkeepers, merchants, and professional bureaucrats. These conditions, which prevented China from achieving its full potential, would be the main target of modernization. Using increased revenue from an agrarian boom in the mid-1950s, the Chinese government would utilize all their resources to push for these much-needed reforms. Education would be made much more accessible through language reform, the expansion of public and vocational schools in rural areas, as well as the introduction of new university scholarships. Technological expertise would be improved by taking advantage of the mechanisms of the co-prosperity sphere, replicating Japanese advances in research for China's interests. Successes in educational and technological reform would then pave the way for larger-scale industrialization. China's growing number of industrial experts would utilize their technical skills to prospect, excavate, and extract valuable resources. Lucrative reserves would be found all over the country, including but not limited to iron in Hunan, copper in Jiangxi, and aluminum in Shandong. These resources would then be used to make various manufactured goods in China, used by the growing consumer base at home and abroad. Despite the great strides made in educational, technological, and industrial reform, modernization, Gao privately said, would only be complete with a total restoration of China's sovereignty. The last 2 pillars of the 5 modernizations sought to achieve this goal. Militarization called for the complete reformation of China's armed forces. The first of these would be the development of new military technology. Development of military technology would be heavily assisted by China's homegrown research and development sector. State-owned companies would be entrusted to carry out the task of developing modern military armaments to engage in armed confrontation in the ground, sea, and air. To effectively use this new equipment, China's military doctrine would require extensive overhauls, which the government was all too keenly aware of. The government would remodel the new doctrine according to the radical nationalist faction's desire, sidelining the military old guard. Beyond the theoretical, Gao's government would quietly expand the size of the Chinese army away from Japan's eyes in what would later be referred to as the Secret Army. Just as quickly as it was being formed, the Secret Army would find itself in a baptism by fire as an insurrection brewed in China's southwestern frontier. The Yunnan province, though legally a constituent part of China, had been under regional warlord control for many decades. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, it had been ruled by Governor Long Yun, who aligned himself with Chiang Kai-shek. However, as the war reached its conclusion, Yun was replaced by his cousin and fellow warlord Lu Han, who pragmatically struck a deal with Japan. Han would rule over the province with Japanese approval for the next few decades, utilizing the province's resources for personal enrichment. Long Yun slowly grew disgruntled with his cousin's governance and Japanese control over China as a whole. Yun's anger would soon find himself aligned with the remnants of the anti-Japanese armed resistance movement, in particular the National Protection Army, or NPA. In late November 1965, with the backing of the NPA and exiled Chinese nationalist generals, Long Yun would launch a coup, ousting his cousin and reigniting large-scale anti-Japanese resistance. On the 6th of May 1966, what was initially expected to be a minor rebellion developed into a full insurrection on a scale that had not been seen since the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Reports trickled into Nanjing spoke of armed units advancing from the southwest, clashing with government garrisons in the region. Furthermore, rumors of a mass exodus of civilians would find their way to the capital, pressuring the government to take immediate action. In this moment of crisis, President Gao would declare a state of emergency, stating that Mad Dog Long Yun's rebellion would be swiftly crushed. Stabilizing the situation would be the first concern of Gao's government. The Chinese army, both open and secret, would be sent in full force to the southwestern border. These troops would be given two main tasks in dealing with the crisis: combating NPA rebel forces in armed confrontation, as well as providing safe passage and temporary housing for displaced civilians fleeing east. Within 5 days of the initial advance, fresh government reinforcements would beat back NPA troops back to the administrative borders of Yunnan and Guizhou province. Soon, Long Yun's men would be swept from the plains, continuously forced to retreat higher and higher into the mountains. Cornered and with no help arriving, the NPA could only wage a hopeless last stand against the inevitable. A little more than 2 months after the beginning of the rebellion, Gao Zongwu would stamp out the stubborn fires of Long Yun's southwestern insurrection. The end of the rebellion in Yunnan would bring a sigh of relief to Nanjing, as the government could once more focus on modernizing without interruption. However, the status quo would once again be upended a few years later in 1969, when the leaking of the Nanjing papers revealed to the ordinary Chinese citizen the extent of the regime's submission to Japan. The relentless exploitation of the common Chinese man to satisfy the interests of Japanese bankers and businessmen was now for all to see. These revelations ignited China's social fabric as workers began protesting their working conditions. Japanese investors fled in droves as anti-Japanese sentiment reached the boiling point, triggering an economic downturn. The government was not spared from the crisis, as many blamed it for enabling Japanese exploitation. With social unrest rising, the economy crashing, and government legitimacy free-falling, Gao would have to act fast to prevent the complete collapse of his rule. After short deliberation, Gao and his ministers would enact their policy to salvage the deteriorating situation. His government would attempt the ultimate balancing act, acquiescing to workers' demands, appeasing Japanese interests, while simultaneously undermining their influence in the economy. For the workers, Gao's government offered minor concessions. Workers from the factories mentioned in the leaks were given compensation, while calls for broader labor reform, which could hurt Japanese investment, were avoided. To increase investment from Tokyo, tax breaks were given to the zaibatsus. To avoid complete capitulation to Tokyo's interests, however, Gao's government discreetly assisted Chinese businessmen in aggressively pushing out their Japanese competitors. The government apparatus would also be purged of corrupt officials to ensure that the bureaucracy could not be bribed into giving more concessions to Japan. As weeks turned into months, the results of Gao's maneuver began to show results. The economy recovered, the public's ire subsided, and the crisis that consumed China seemingly dissipated. However, this was not to last, as developments abroad would once again take China by storm. In November 1970, just as China finally recovered from the Nanjing paper scandal, the outbreak of various civil wars in the Middle East would disrupt global oil supplies, triggering a worldwide economic crisis. The turmoil would not spare China. Within weeks of the oil crisis, Chinese supply of fuel quickly dried up. Chinese industry, heavily reliant on oil to fuel its activities, screeched to a grinding halt. In the streets, sweeping gas shortages triggered social unrest as citizens lined up for their share of the primary good. The desperate would take matters into their own hands, taking what they could by force in acts of banditry. In the factories, the consequences of half-hearted reforms during the Nanjing crisis would return to the forefront as workers demanded better working conditions. Pressured to alleviate the crisis, Gao's government took immediate action to end the oil crisis in China once and for all. Gao and his ministers would devise a two-pronged approach aimed at resolving the resource and social crisis. In dealing with the issue of dwindling oil reserves, the government would take actions to cope with the limited resources in the short term, while also finding new ways to increase their supply in the long term. Temporarily, the government would allocate oil to only the most essential industries, leaving others to operate in limited capacity. Price controls would also be enacted to prevent price gouging and inflation. Simultaneously, China would attempt to end the resource problem by producing oil at home. Thanks to expertise cultivated during modernization, China's experts proposed the possibility of finding offshore oil inside territorial waters. Such a project would put Nanjing up against Tokyo's naval dominance in the East China Sea, making it unlikely for the Japanese to allow it. Despite these potential threats, Gao's government would give the green light to start the project. In short order, Chinese exploration teams would strike black gold on the shores of Shanghai. Soon, China would begin to initiate negotiations for Japanese permission to build the offshore oil rigs. After high-stakes diplomatic talks between the two countries, the Japanese would grant permission to develop the offshore oil drilling facilities. Months later, these efforts would bear fruit as China's oil supply headed towards a surplus, ending the resource front of the oil crisis. Just as developments on resolving the oil crisis were underway, Gao's government sought to quell the social upheaval burning in the cities, countryside, and factories. China's leaders realized early on that if any semblance of order was to return, the government had to enact popular reforms. They also understood that complete capitulation to demands on the streets would set a dangerous precedent which could erode their rule over the country. The government would therefore proceed with a moderate strategy, enacting enough social reforms to satisfy the masses without destroying their own power base. In the factories, the government would meet workers' demands. Sweeping welfare reforms for workers would be mandated, increasing wages, improving healthcare, and giving guarantees to the families of those injured or killed. In the countryside, the government would initiate partial land reform to help ease tensions in the brewing agrarian conflict. Land owned by landowners would be bought by the government for anti-poverty campaigns. Peasants, on the other hand, would be encouraged to create farmland on their own, as the government would encourage the reclamation of previously uncultivated land. As the dust settled, people would return to their normal lives, as many of the popular grievances would have been met by the government. The crisis which had ravaged China was now over. China's position appeared more robust than ever by 1972. Under Gao Zongwu's leadership, what was once merely the breadbasket of the co-prosperity sphere had bloomed into an industrial powerhouse. This newfound prestige, it was hoped, would be what it would take for Japan to see China as an equal. The opportunity to prove it would soon come in the Co-Prosperity Sphere Summit, set to be hosted in Nanjing in early 1973. The Chinese government had already been hard at work at preparing for the occasion when in late 1972, using Manchurian diplomatic channels, Japan informed Gao's government that the summit had been abruptly moved to Taipei. The message was clear for all to see, and the summit would make these intentions even clearer. The Taipei Summit Agreement, which was signed at the end of the meeting, granted even more economic concessions to Japan. The Chinese people had had enough. Students went to the streets to protest, workers went on strike, business owners closed up shop, and parliament was in chaos. Despite this, Gao had carefully maneuvered to make sure that this last humiliation would be the last. Within the meeting halls of the Taipei Summit, Gao managed to gain a concession stating Japan's nominal support for Chinese unification. With it, he could set off to complete the last of the 5 modernizations, reunification. With Japan's tacit approval for Chinese unification, Gao would begin the process of reintegrating the independent provinces under Nanjing's control. The process would first begin in the northwest, in the province of Qinghai. The province had been one of the last holdouts of anti-Japanese KMT resistance, being controlled by the NRA 40th Army Group. In May 1973, a major conflict would erupt in the province against the regional Japanese frontier garrison. Gao, sensing an opportunity, would begin making secret contacts with the NRA leaders of Qinghai. With the support of Nanjing, the conflict would end in a success as the infamous Japanese general in charge of the region, Tsuji Masanobu, would be killed in the operations. Gao's support of the Qinghai generals would gain their trust, who would soon negotiate their reintegration into China proper. Soon, the remaining provincial warlords would follow suit, as the provinces of Qinghai, Zhejiang, Guangxi, Shaanxi, and Xinjiang would be reincorporated into China. Tibet would be the last non-Japanese-backed province to be brought back into the fold. Despite Tibet's de facto independence for 50 years, the KMT saw it as rightful Chinese territory. In February 1974, the fate of Tibet was decided when Chinese army units crossed the Sino-Tibetan frontier, triggering an armed conflict. Despite their best efforts, Tibetan resistance was futile as they were no match for the better-equipped Chinese forces. By May 1974, organized resistance had all but ended as the polity was reincorporated into China as an autonomous region. By the dawn of the 1970s, just as Pushkin had done in Russia, Gao Zongwu was able to completely reverse the fate of China by perfectly taking advantage of its unique circumstances. China was able to achieve 4 out of their 5 modernization programs by carrying out necessary internal reform and utilizing Japanese commitments towards the co-prosperity sphere. By 1974, taking advantage of Japanese indifference, Gao Zongwu was able to maneuver through the humiliating Taipei summit to advance the final tenet of the 5 modernizations, reunification. Within less than 2 years after the agreement, the Chinese frontier had finally been brought back into the fold by the Nanjing government. Now, all that was left were the Japanese puppet states of Manchuria, Mongolia, and Guangdong. Though some were hopeful that total unification could be brought about through diplomacy, Gao believed that it could only be won through blood.